In case you haven't noticed, I have been gone for a little while, a few months actually. The fall/winter is when my work as a freelance audio engineer really kicks up, and also just like just being a person, it's a busy time. This means not only that I haven't been making videos, but I also just haven't been playing games as much, and it's been difficult. So in order to scratch that RPG itch that I get, and you probably get too if you're watching this video, I've been listening to a bunch of RPG podcasts, and I'm going to share my top 7 with you today here on Adventure Night. Now, when you think of RPG podcasts or D&D podcasts, you're probably thinking of actual plays. Some of the most famous content for Dungeons & Dragons are actual play podcasts like Critical Role and Dimension 20. This is how a lot of people get onboarded into the hobby, and so it means that it's one of the major tentpoles of the hobby in the modern era. However, there are actually lots of different types of RPG flavored podcasts out there, and I'm going to cover 7 of my favorites right now, not really in any particular order. Now, I've come up with 6 categories that I feel like all RPG podcasts pretty much fall into. Each podcast on this list is at least in one of these categories, sometimes in 2 and maybe even 3. So there's a bit of flexibility, but these categories allow me to kind of quantify what each of these podcasts does, so that depending on what you're looking for, you'll have an easier time figuring out the right fit for you. Category number 1 is advice. This covers anything from how to be a better game master to how to write better adventures, or even just how to keep your players invested in the type of game that you really want to run. Category number 2 is news. This is all about what is currently happening in the TTRPG industry, and often it has a lot to do with what Wizards of the Coast is doing with Dungeons & Dragons proper, since they're the biggest and everything that they do has ripple effects throughout the entire industry. Category number 3 is actual play. Now, as I said earlier, this is probably the form of RPG podcast that you're most familiar with. Actual play podcasts involve watching or listening to a group of people play an RPG. Category 4 are reviews. These are any sort of discussions of the quality of game systems or adventures. This is a category that I'm particularly interested in because this is a lot of what I create on my own YouTube channel, and so I spend a lot of time listening to reviews of products, in part to know what to buy, but also just to know how to critique these things as works of art, or as works of, functional game material. The 5th category is interviews. These are podcasts where usually a static, consistent host interviews different people from all over the industry, whether they're adventure writers, people who are just very prominent in the scene. And the final category is history. These are podcasts that deal specifically with the history of tabletop role-playing games, and usually that involves the history of Dungeons & Dragons proper, because it is the oldest tabletop role-playing game. Alright, so those are the 6 categories: advice, news, actual play, reviews, interviews, and history. I'm going to use these to describe the podcasts that I'm going to talk about so that you know really where they fall on this very broad spectrum of RPG podcasts. And with that, let's get to our first selection today. This is a podcast called When We Were Wizards, and it is squarely a history podcast, although I guess you could also call it an interview podcast. But the main focus of When We Were Wizards is to tell the story of the inception of Dungeons & Dragons back in the 70s all the way into the 80s, specifically through the life of Gary Gygax, who was one of the co-creators of the original Dungeons & Dragons and remained the head of the company that produced it for quite a while into that company's existence. However, if you listen to the podcast, you'll see that the story of Gary Gygax is an extremely tumultuous one, and all the people who entered and left his life have so many different things to say about him and about that time in history. And what's amazing about this podcast is that it's not just 2 guys spitting, facts at you for several episodes. It is told through interviews with the people who were actually there. Hosts Adam Turner, who is a screenwriter, and Paul Stormberg, who is a D&D historian, interviewed dozens of people who were present at the creation of Dungeons and Dragons, people who were close to Gary Gygax and the other co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons, Dave Arneson, about what was happening back in the 70s when the game was getting created. This podcast honestly was my inspiration to do this video because I just listened to it and I absolutely loved it so much. If you really like podcasts like Serial, where it's a very high quality journalistic look at something that happened in the past, you're going to absolutely love When We Were Wizards. It's also a limited number of episodes. I think it's maybe 13 or 14, so it's not a lot to bite off. You can just start listening and then you'll be done. I was done within a month. And it's really just, it's great content all around. In terms of paid content, there is not any. A number of these podcasts on this list have like a specific paid tier where you get extra stuff, but this one is just the podcast itself, which you can get on any podcast streaming platform, and then also in terms of free content, they post pictures on their Instagram account, which you can find, I think it's just at When We Were Wizards. Moving on to the next podcast, this one is called Limithron's Ship of the Dead podcast, and it is hosted by none other than our favorite creator of Pirate Borg, Luke Stratton, and it is squarely an interview podcast, at least at the moment. The Ship of the Dead podcast is actually one of the podcasts that first got me listening to RPG podcasts, because I'll be honest with you, I was not really a podcast guy before I started getting into these. And Limithron's Ship of the Dead was a big reason why I was able to break into this sphere. A lot of that is because Luke is just an incredible host. He is so interested in what his guests have to say, and he asks fantastic questions that I think reveal a lot about them as people and also just about their approach to this artwork. One of my favorite things about Ship of the Dead podcast is that, unlike some other interview podcasts that I have listened to, like, even though Luke Stratton is brilliant in his own right, he does not take up a whole bunch of space while he's interviewing. He really lets the guests do their thing because he's so genuinely interested in what they have to do and not interested in like tooting his own horn a whole bunch, that you really get this cool, very casual conversation. In terms of episodes I recommend you check out, the last episode that they released, I think almost a year ago now, maybe a little bit more, is the State of the OSR panel, which comes from GaryCon last year, where a whole bunch of luminaries, including Yochai Gal, Kelsey Dion, Brad Kerr, are all together talking about like what the OSR is at this time in history, and it's fantastic. Now, unfortunately, Limithron's Ship of the Dead podcast has not had an episode since then, which on the one hand means it's a fairly digestible series, so it's not like, you know, hundreds of episodes, but it means that there's not new content. So once you run out, you're kind of out. And my understanding, based on what I've read on the Limithron Discord, is that in the future, the podcast will be moving away from its interview format, which I think is a shame, but I'm also really excited to see what they churn out next. In terms of paid content, there isn't any paid content for the podcast specifically, but you can follow the Limithron Patreon to get a whole bunch of maps and access to early stuff for Dark Caribbean and upcoming Pirate Borg projects and stuff like that. Next up is Blogs on Tape. This is a very interesting project in which the host, Nick Ellis Whelan, who is a blogger in and of himself, has collected a whole bunch of interesting blog posts from across the OSR space and recorded them so that you can listen to them kind of like audiobooks. And some of them are 8-minute long little blurbs, and then some of them are, you know, 1 hour long huge theory pieces. I will be honest, only some of the episodes interest me, but that's fine because there's so many, you can just kind of pick and choose what you want to listen to in that moment. In terms of episodes I really like, I highly recommend The OSR Should Die, which is a recording of a blog by Marsha B that talks about like the whole history of the OSR going back to the 2000s, starting with Osric and the way that it kind of evolved and different, you know, play styles came out of it. It was hugely important for me when it came to understanding like what the OSR actually was as a culture and as a space, and also the question of whether it even still exists. Now, this podcast definitely has more of a focus on like OSR themed content because it was sort of born out of the blogosphere, which was this kind of collection of bloggers that were all sharing and consuming each other's content back on Google+. And if you are familiar with this, you probably just went, Google+. And if you are not familiar with this, you're probably going, Google+? But yes, Google+ was a big hub of OSR creators back before it was shut down in 2019, and apparently it made it very, very easy to share blogs and read blogs all together, so there were a ton of just thoughts zooming around at this time in the 2010s. Blogs on Tape doesn't have any paid content or anything like that, but you can go to Nick's blog, paperspencils.com, to support it with donations. And yeah, I highly recommend checking out. It's very relaxing. He's got a nice reading voice, and there's a lot of really cool information in there that totally changed the way that I look at RPGs, not just OSR games, but more trad games as well. So hopefully you find something there that is interesting to you. Next up is Between Two Cairns. This is a review podcast mostly, but I would say it also contains a fair amount of advice, because every episode the hosts answer a question from their mailbag, which usually involves them giving their opinions on a specific either rules-related, thing, or just generally something having to do with playing RPGs. The hosts of this podcast are Yochai Gall, who is the creator of the Cairn RPG, and Brad Kerr, who is an adventure writer and has done a lot of work for Old School Essentials. These days he's working for Necrotic Gnome, who make Old School Essentials, and he's written adventure collections like Wyvern Songs, as well as single adventures. And these two really are like giants in the RPG space, especially in the OSR space. They really know their stuff. I think they are kind of representative of a certain generation of creators for OSR content. And they're also just like ridiculously funny and charming to listen to. Between Two Cairns is far and away one of my favorite listening experiences like ever. It's just so enjoyable to listen to these guys talk about pretty much anything, which I think is like the sweet spot for podcasts. I think that if you get into a place where it's like you could have your listeners listen to you just sort of like shoot the shit, then you have figured out the formula. You've solved it. Yochai and Brad are also frequently joined by Sam Mameli, who is an illustrator, also goes by Skullboy, works on lots of RPG products, including The Waking of Willoughby Hall and Barkeep on the Borderlands. Sam has become a more consistent host in recent months, and I think that's really great because he offers an illustrator's perspective on all of the modules that they review. Now, Between Two Cairns is fundamentally an adventure reviewing podcast, so they'll really cover, adventures from all across the RPG space, mostly OSR stuff, but occasionally they'll dip into other things, and they talk frequently about old adventure modules, and they talk about them with no nostalgia attached, which can be pretty interesting because it can give you sort of a more, I think, accurate perspective on like what a classic, maybe 1970s or 1980s adventure will play like at your modern table. So yeah, truly cannot recommend Between Two Cairns enough. In terms of paid content, they have a Patreon, which will give you access to bonus episodes, but you can also just access all of the episodes that are already out there for free on any podcast streaming platform. Next up is a very cool, sort of limited podcast called Into the Megadungeon, which is hosted by Ben Laurence, who is the author of the adventure zines Through Oltan's Door, and a sort of big name in the OSR space. This podcast is really interesting because it seeks to answer a big question that I've had for a while, which is why run a Megadungeon? A Megadungeon, of course, if you don't know, is sort of a massive subterranean, usually, dungeon in which an entire campaign can take place and be centered around. Megadungeons usually have 100+ rooms with a whole bunch of levels. Into the Megadungeon is an advice/interview podcast. It has advice for running Megadungeons, but also each episode is an interview with someone who is important either to Megadungeons as a genre or just has a lot of experience running Megadungeons themselves, including James Malashevsky from Grognardia and Josh McCrowell, who's the creator of His Majesty the Worm. Highly recommend that episode. Josh McCrell has a lot of really interesting things to say about just dungeon design in general. Every time I hear that guy talk, he makes me want to buy his game, and I don't have any reason to buy his game because I don't play Megadungeons. Although, after listening to this entire podcast series, which is, maybe like 10, 12 episodes, I've definitely changed my tune on that a little bit, so we'll see what happens. As far as I know, there's no paid content for Into the Megadungeon, but you can check out Ben Laurence's blog. Getting close to the end of our list, the second to last podcast I'd like to tell you about is the Vintage RPG podcast. This is hosted by Stu Horvath, who is the author of Monsters, Aliens, and Holes in the Ground, and also just kind of a role-playing game historian in his own right. And also John Hambone McGuire, who is the creator of the 321 RPG. And this podcast has been going on, I think, the longest of all the podcasts on this list. They've been making episodes since before the pandemic and consistently releasing them, talking about all different kinds of things, from specific modules to games. They interview different, luminaries in the RPG space every once in a while, and they also sometimes just talk about like TSR, tie-in toys for D&D back from the 80s. It's a real grab bag of things, but that means that whenever I scroll through the podcast feed, there's a ton of episodes to look at, and there's always something that I'm interested in clicking on and listening to. So I'd say that this podcast is a review podcast because they review, like modules and systems every once in a while, but it's also an interview podcast because they do have episodes where they just sort of interview interesting creators. One episode that I really enjoyed was when they interviewed Errol Otis, who did art for TSR back in the 70s and 80s, and you can see his work on like the Holmes Basic D&D box set. Really cool to hear what he has to say. And then I would also say that this podcast falls under the category of history as well, because they do talk about not just old modules and vintage RPG books, but also kind of like where they came from, what the experience was like when they launched, which is one of my favorite things to learn about because it really gives you a sense of like what did people like back then. In terms of paid content for the Vintage RPG podcast, they have a Patreon with multiple tiers. Some of those subscription tiers even entitle you to play in a couple of their games. I know that John McGuire runs games himself of all different types of RPGs, and then Stu Horvath runs a West Marches game, which has been going for like 3 years in Old School Essentials. So if that's something you're interested in being a part of, hit up their Patreon, see if it's the kind of thing that works for you. But definitely just listen to the podcast as it is. I think it's a lot of fun. And they have an Instagram, and they have, a blog for it and everything. So there's lots of ways to engage with Vintage RPG podcast. And they're experts. They've been doing this for a long time. They know what they're doing. And the final podcast on this list, I know I said that these weren't in any particular order, but this one is my favorite, is Mystery Quest. Mystery Quest is an actual play podcast. It is the only actual play podcast on this list, and the reason for that is I don't like actual play podcasts. Mystery Quest is pretty much the only actual play podcast that I've ever been able to engage with, and I think that there's a couple reasons for that. Number one is that the episodes are very bite-sized. Instead of, here's a 4.5 hour Critical Role episode that you can listen to in, 10 different sittings, they do, here's 1 hour of our game, you can listen to it, in a couple car rides, and then you can decide if you want to continue on to the next episode, if you're enjoying it, or you can not. But each episode has a beginning and it has an end. And then I think the other major reason that I really, really like it and engage with it is because it's by a lot of the people who are on the Yogscast, which is a British video game YouTube channel that I've been a fan of since I was literally a child. And so if you know any of their content, it's really, really cool to see people that, I engaged with when I was younger playing RPGs, which is the thing that I'm engaging with now. So it's a lot of fun. But the biggest reason why I love Mystery Quest is because it feels like watching friends play RPGs. Nobody who plays in the games are like professional actors. A lot of them, they are content creators, streamers, and YouTubers. You can really tell that everybody playing is having a really, really good time. And also, almost every single series that they do, which usually are, you know, maybe 3 to 6 episodes, is a one-shot. The structure of Mystery Quest is that they play a bunch of different one-shots in a bunch of different systems. This was a crucial way for me to learn about new games and also kind of learn how to play them, because you get a sense of what the sort of gameplay flow is when you watch them played. The host, Tom, who GMs all the games, is, I think, like the perfect dungeon master, because he just is like really interested in it. He loves prepping, he loves creating stuff for it, but he's not like, you all are here to play through my story and everything's gonna go exactly the way that I anticipate it, and I'm gonna railroad the crap out of you so that you make everything happen. And Mystery Quest really feels like a bunch of people sort of creating a story together, and Tom is not like doing a million incredible voices, but every single NPC that he runs is like charming and funny and has very interesting engagements with the characters, sometimes literal engagements. And every once in a while, even though the games are just one-shots, characters from previous one-shots will return, and it'll be really exciting to see them again, and sometimes they'll die and sometimes they'll live, and it's just, I don't know, man, it's as if it was made for me, and I hope that it was made for you as well. In terms of paid content, Mystery Quest, you can subscribe to their Patreon or you can become a YouTube member. They're both the same thing. They both give you bonus episodes, which are usually like character creation sessions from the games that they play or post-game chats. And in my opinion, just for like the character creation sessions alone, especially if you're interested in playing a lot of these games, it's worth it. I don't know, man. I really like it. It speaks to me. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. I hope that you enjoyed learning about a couple RPG podcasts. Maybe you heard some that you already know. Maybe you heard some new ones that you'd like to check out. Please, in the comments below, put your choices for what you would have on this list. Are there any RPG podcasts, either OSR, traditional D&D, you know, theory, advice, history, anything that you find really interesting that I didn't mention? Please tell me about it. I would love to hear and maybe check it out myself. And then last but certainly not least, make sure if you enjoyed this video to like it and also subscribe to my channel for more content in a similar vein. The type of videos that I make are not like really great, flashy, you know, D&D 5e, the algorithm loves this and will push it to everybody type videos. So it's very important if you want to support my channel to turn notifications on for my videos and also share it with your friends and other people who you might want to introduce to the kind of content that I'm creating. I'm really looking forward to making more videos in 2026, so keep an eye out for all different kinds of stuff, from reviews of products to more sort of like broader theory things. So there's going to be a whole lot to dig into, and I really hope that you can join me throughout the rest of the year.